According to preliminary reports, intercepted just minutes before official confirmation, several unmanned aerial vehicles crossed the airspace over a NATO military airfield located on the border of Central Europe. The first explosions were heard around 4:17 local time. For a few moments, the world didn't yet understand what had happened. The night sky was illuminated by flashes, air defense sirens echoed through empty streets, and news feeds filled with fragments of unverified messages. What initially seemed like an isolated incident began to expand in scale, transforming from a local episode into the prologue of something larger, something that would later be called the point of no return. Analysts note that the timing of the strike was not accidental. Just hours earlier, diplomatic representatives had left a series of meetings in Brussels without comment, while several intelligence channels reported unusual activity in military networks. In the first minutes, everyone spoke in whispers. Could this really be happening? But the whispers turned into open statements. Within half an hour, the first emergency briefings began, each more uncertain than the last. Official spokespeople avoided clear language, and even seasoned journalists hesitated to label what they were witnessing. Yet the silence between their words said more than any statement could. The images emerging online, blurry, trembling footage taken from mobile phones, showed a distant horizon on fire. Some said it was a fuel depot, others, the runway itself. The truth dissolved in a storm of speculation. Governments tried to control the narrative, but the speed of information made it impossible. By the time the first press release appeared, the world had already drawn its own conclusions. A NATO facility had been hit, and no one yet knew by whom. From the moment of that first explosion, the logic of peace began to unravel. Insiders describe a sudden shift in tone across diplomatic channels. Conversations became colder, shorter, almost mechanical. One senior official, speaking anonymously, confessed that the phrase, "this changes everything," was repeated dozens of times across private chats and encrypted lines. Markets reacted within minutes. Oil prices spiked, defense stocks surged, and currencies trembled in digital silence. But behind the economic tremors lay something deeper, the realization that an invisible line had been crossed. In the control rooms of major news networks, editors faced an impossible dilemma: report what little they knew, or wait for confirmation that might never come. Some chose caution, others instinct. Screens glowed with the same haunting images: smoke rising above the tarmac, silhouettes of fire trucks moving through haze, voices shouting in several languages at once. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, as if the world's pulse had quickened. By dawn, no one was asleep. Government buildings across Europe turned their lights back on, long after midnight briefings had ended. Somewhere, in a dimly lit office, someone drafted a statement that would later be remembered as the moment diplomacy gave way to reaction. Intelligence analysts gathered fragments of data, radar anomalies, intercepted signals, satellite flashes, and tried to fit them into a coherent story. None succeeded. Each version contradicted the last. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Unofficially, everything was already believed. Commentators cautiously spoke of an unprecedented provocation. Retired officers compared the images to the early hours of conflicts they had hoped to never relive. Every sentence carried a tremor. Every pause felt deliberate. And through this cautious rhetoric, a new kind of fear began to spread. Not the fear of what had happened, but of what might come next. The night of the drones became the morning of uncertainty. It was as if the entire information sphere inhaled and held its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to define the moment. But no definition came. Only fragments, echoes, and the strange sense that something irreversible had already begun. The world had not yet realized it, but history had quietly shifted its course. In private analytical channels, experts began using a phrase that soon trended across dark corners of the internet: the point of no return. It wasn't about geography or borders. It was about perception, the psychological threshold after which the illusion of safety could no longer exist. The drones didn't just strike a target, they struck the collective consciousness of nations. And as morning light spread across the continent, one realization lingered in every newsroom, every embassy, every silent apartment watching the news in disbelief. The world we woke up to was no longer the same. There would be explanations, denials, and accusations in the hours ahead. But before any of them were spoken, a single truth had already taken root. The era of stability was over. And whatever came next would no longer be contained by diplomacy or reason. The point of no return had been reached, and there was no going back. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. What had once been an orderly military hub now looked like a canvas painted with smoke, steel, and confusion. The fire that consumed the hangar still glowed through the thick gray haze, its reflection trembling on shards of broken glass scattered across the runway. Emergency crews moved in silence, their movements methodical yet hesitant, as if the ground beneath them might still hold secrets. By that hour, communication lines were saturated. Every channel pulsed with fragments of data, air traffic recordings, intercepted signals, conflicting eyewitness accounts. A senior NATO officer, his voice trembling in a leaked transmission, could be heard saying only, "We are blind." No one knew exactly what that meant, whether it referred to their radar systems, their political awareness, or their ability to control the unfolding chaos. What was certain, however, was that no one felt in control anymore. Official statements began to surface, each one carefully measured and incomplete. The first declared that an unidentified aerial incident had occurred. The second corrected it, a coordinated drone attack of unknown origin. Within minutes, an alternative version appeared, that the strike had been intercepted and damage was minimal. Yet the images spreading across digital feeds contradicted every word. There were bodies being carried on stretchers, fuel lines ablaze, and a crater that couldn't be explained by a mere malfunction. Inside the crisis centers, analysts fought exhaustion and disbelief. Screens displayed endless loops of footage, thermal signatures, flight trajectories, emergency broadcasts from local media already overwhelmed by the flood of speculation. Every frame seemed to whisper a different story. Some suggested that the drones had been remote operated from outside European borders. Others hinted that the technology was far too advanced for any non-state actor. That alone sent shivers through intelligence circles. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, the kind that comes not from calm, but from the suspension of all known order. Helicopters hovered above the smoking ruins, their blades stirring the ash into spiraling columns. Civilians gathered on nearby hills, watching in silence. No one spoke. Some filmed, others prayed. A few simply stood there, unable to process that something irreversible was taking shape before their eyes. In underground command rooms, the atmosphere thickened with tension. One source described it as the kind of silence that follows before someone makes the worst decision of their life. Conversations shifted from containment to retaliation, from facts to assumptions. Every unanswered question bred new ones. Was this a test? A warning? A declaration? None of the possibilities were comforting. Across Europe, alarms blared in embassies. High-level communication channels opened and closed within seconds, messages marked urgent but devoid of clarity. Some leaders demanded evidence before reaction. Others demanded reaction before evidence. The machinery of coordination began to falter. Too many voices, too much fear, not enough truth. The architecture of unity trembled under the weight of collective uncertainty. And amid the chaos, a narrative began to form, not from facts, but from emotion. News anchors, pale and fatigued, filled the airwaves with repetition and conjecture. Phrases like, according to preliminary data, sources close to intelligence circles, and we cannot yet confirm, became the rhythm of the morning. The public's hunger for answers turned into frustration, then anger. In digital spaces, the vacuum was filled by noise, fabricated footage, manipulated statements, the language of suspicion replacing the language of reason. By the second hour after the explosions, something even more dangerous emerged. Not the fire, not the smoke, but the idea that truth itself had become irrelevant. People didn't want explanations anymore. They wanted sides. On one, the conviction that Russia had orchestrated the attack. On the other, the belief that the incident had been provoked from within to justify something greater. Between these two certainties lay only silence. And silence, as always, breeds fear. The airfield itself had become a symbol, not just of vulnerability, but of exposure. A mirror reflecting the fragility of the entire system built on deterrence and balance. The very principles that once kept peace now seemed to paralyze it. Intelligence analysts whispered that this wasn't a random act, that the drones had targeted a communications hub critical for coordination between air forces. But when asked for confirmation, officials offered only the same phrase, investigation ongoing. Inside the perimeter, soldiers moved like ghosts through smoke. One of them, his face streaked with soot, looked into a camera and muttered words that would echo far beyond that morning. We were not ready for the silence. It was unclear what he meant, but those who heard it understood instinctively. It wasn't just the silence of broken systems or disabled radars. It was the silence that follows the instant before history rewrites itself. Outside, as reporters gathered behind the fences, the wind shifted. A burnt chemical smell filled the air, sharp and heavy. Cameras rolled, and for a moment, the world saw what official statements refused to acknowledge: the look in people's eyes, the mix of disbelief and recognition, the faint awareness that this was not an isolated strike, but the beginning of something deeper, something that would ripple far beyond that runway. And so the morning stretched on, endless and surreal. The fire dimmed, the smoke thinned, but the confusion only thickened. Governments issued condolences instead of explanations. Markets opened under tension. Social feeds pulsed with fury and disbelief. No one yet called it war, not officially, but everyone spoke as if it had already begun. In the corridors of power, decisions were being drafted that could not be undone. They would call it a response, a measure of security, an act of necessity. But behind every phrase, there lingered the same unspoken truth. The shadow cast over that airfield had now fallen over the entire continent. The illusion of distance was gone. The front line was no longer somewhere else. It was everywhere. And beneath all the words, the denials, the promises, a single thought whispered in the minds of those who still dared to think clearly. The world had entered a storm it could no longer predict, and perhaps no longer control. By the time the sun had risen over Brussels, the story was no longer a mystery. It had become a weapon. Each government, each alliance, each intelligence outlet was already shaping the narrative that would serve its interests. What began as confusion turned into orchestration. The search for truth was replaced by the battle for control. And within the echo chambers of diplomacy, every word became a spark that could ignite a global fire. At 9:43 local time, the first emergency summit convened. Representatives of NATO's core council entered the chamber with faces that betrayed sleepless nights and private panic. Outside, the cameras flashed. Inside, the language became measured, heavy, deliberate. The Secretary General's voice was calm but brittle as glass when he spoke the words that would dominate headlines for days. An attack on one is an attack on all. He did not say by whom. He did not need to. The implication filled the silence more effectively than any direct accusation could. Across the table, advisors shuffled papers filled with half-confirmed data, radar signatures, satellite images, intercepted communications. The evidence, if it could be called that, was fragmented, inconsistent, yet damning in its tone. The conclusion most wanted to reach had already been decided before the meeting began. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about posture, and posture required an enemy. Moscow responded within the hour. The statement, carried across international channels, denied involvement with the precision of a rehearsed performance. The tone was cold, disciplined, and deeply ironic. The Russian Federation has no connection to the alleged incident and considers any attempt to attribute responsibility as a provocation, but the world had heard similar phrases before. Each one had lost a fragment of credibility over time, and this one fell into the noise like another piece of broken glass on an already shattered floor. In Washington, tension crackled through the Situation Room. Screens displayed live feeds from European capitals, each one reflecting the same choreography of outrage and caution. Advisors spoke in code, defensive readiness, strategic consultation, coordinated messaging. In simpler words, the West was preparing for retaliation, even as it pretended to seek peace. Diplomatic channels began to overheat. Private calls between ministers were followed by leaked transcripts within minutes. One European diplomat, unaware that his microphone was still on, muttered, "They want blood, but they'll call it justice." His words traveled faster than any official communique. The first sanctions packages were drafted before the investigation was even complete. Economists warned that this time, the pressure would not be symbolic. Supply chains trembled under the weight of anticipation. Gas flows, trade corridors, defense contracts, all suddenly became instruments of strategy. A new kind of warfare began, not with missiles, but with signatures and embargoes. Behind closed doors, however, cracks began to show. Some nations urged restraint, arguing that escalation without certainty could spiral beyond control. Others saw hesitation as weakness. One ambassador, visibly shaken, whispered to a colleague, "We are walking on the edge of history, and no one is willing to look down." Televised addresses followed one another in rapid succession. Each leader, under the glow of artificial studio lights, spoke the same language of firmness and sorrow. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay the same calculation. How far can we go without falling into the abyss? The irony was bitter. Every speech meant to prevent war only seemed to make it more inevitable. In the corridors of the United Nations, delegates moved like actors in a play whose ending they already knew. Meetings extended deep into the night, filled with ritual condemnations and carefully worded resolutions. Yet the air in the chamber was different now. Heavier, more fragile. Words no longer carried persuasion, they carried premonition. The global media, sensing blood, amplified the storm. Each headline screamed urgency. Each broadcast sharpened the emotional edge. The public, deprived of certainty, demanded action. Fear had become the new common language. And fear, as history always reminds, is the most efficient form of consensus. Meanwhile, intelligence briefings behind the scenes revealed unsettling patterns. Intercepted drone telemetry that traced paths too precise, too complex to be improvised. A senior analyst described it as a script written by someone who knew how we would respond. The phrase lingered in the air like an accusation against fate itself. In one unconfirmed report, a diplomatic convoy en route to a crisis negotiation was rerouted due to a credible threat. In another, an encrypted conversation between high-ranking officials ended abruptly. The final words recorded were, "They're already preparing for what comes next." By the evening, the division between rhetoric and reality had vanished. NATO's official communiqué declared a coordinated and proportionate response, though no one could yet define what proportionate meant. Military planners began reactivating old contingency maps once thought obsolete. Generals who had retired returned to their offices. Advisors who once spoke of deterrence now spoke of endurance. And through all of it, an invisible clock began to tick. Not toward midnight, but toward inevitability. Each diplomatic gesture, each press statement, each handshake that didn't quite touch felt like a countdown. The illusion of order still held, but only just. Beneath it, something far older stirred. The ancient rhythm of escalation, the logic of vengeance dressed in the language of law. As one analyst wrote in a confidential memo that would never reach the public, the machinery of diplomacy has not failed. It has simply completed its purpose, to delay the inevitable long enough for it to seem accidental. Outside, in the cold evening air, journalists waited for statements that no longer mattered. The world had entered a new grammar, one of blame, justification, and fear. Each country rehearsed its lines, each alliance drew its boundaries. And in the distance, beneath the static hum of 1,000 news broadcasts, a quiet question lingered in the mind of every observer. When responsibility becomes a weapon, can truth survive the crossfire? No one answered. Perhaps because, in that moment, no one dared. It began without warning. Not with speeches, not with votes or press releases, but with the faint mechanical hum of aircraft engines slicing through the pre-dawn stillness. At 3:12 local time, the first coordinated wave was launched. The order had been signed hours earlier, somewhere in a windowless room filled with low voices and the clicking of pens. By the time it reached the field, the decision was already irreversible. What followed was not rage, it was mathematics. The retaliation was precise, deliberate, stripped of emotion. Satellites adjusted their orbit to guide the assault. Command screens glowed in sterile blues and reds, depicting arcs of flight and zones of impact. Operators moved like surgeons, their faces lit by the cold light of targeting coordinates. Each confirmed lock was followed by a brief, almost ritual pause, a moment not of hesitation, but of acknowledgement. When the missiles were finally released, they vanished into the horizon like silent oaths. Observers described the attack as surgical. The term itself had long lost meaning. There was nothing surgical about what followed. The first explosions rippled across radar installations, communication hubs, and logistics centers deep within hostile territory. Fireballs lit the night sky over multiple coordinates simultaneously, synchronized by algorithms and human intent. In less than 8 minutes, the air was filled with echoes, the kind of echo that doesn't return. Officially, the targets were defined as military infrastructure directly linked to the aggression. Unofficially, they were chosen to send a message. The message was simple. The world had crossed into the phase where restraint was no longer a virtue. The illusion of diplomacy evaporated somewhere between the first detonation and the second confirmation of impact. Inside the command centers, silence reigned. The only sounds were mechanical. The rhythm of ventilators, the static of encrypted transmissions, the faint murmur of analysts confirming data. The generals stood motionless, staring at the screens that transformed destruction into color-coded abstractions. Blue turned red. Red disappeared. Each pulse of light on the display marked another erased coordinate, another irreversible act. One observer later wrote in a confidential memo, "The most terrifying sound that night was not the explosion itself, but the absence of reaction in the room when it happened. The operators didn't cheer, didn't flinch. They simply marked objective neutralized, and waited for the next line of coordinates to appear. It wasn't vengeance anymore. It was procedure. From the outside, the assault looked like a spectacle: precision, synchronization, technological dominance. But beneath that veneer of control lay the quiet dread of those who understood what it meant. Each detonation was not just an answer. It was an echo of all the choices that had led there. The retaliation was meant to restore balance, yet it only deepened the imbalance between fear and reason. As dawn approached, communication channels erupted with panic. Air traffic maps were flooded with emergency reroutes. Civilian frequencies picked up fragments of coded military chatter. Local news broadcasts, interrupted mid-segment, struggled to translate the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Words like escalation, unprecedented, containment lost their precision through repetition. Reality had already outgrown language. On the ground, the scenes were surreal. Entire industrial districts flickered like dying stars. Power grids failed in cascades, their collapse traveling faster than the missiles themselves. Fire reflected off metallic structures, giving the illusion that the earth itself was burning from within. Among the ruins, the first responders moved in silence, unsure whether the danger had passed or merely paused. In the hours that followed, officials appeared on screens across the world, their statements uniform and hollow. A measured response, they called it. A defense of collective security. But even as they spoke, new coordinates were being calculated. The rhythm of conflict had found its tempo, and no one seemed willing to slow it down. Inside diplomatic circles, attempts to reopen communication channels met static. Hotlines that once promised crisis prevention now buzzed with unanswered calls. The world's most powerful decision-makers were awake, but not speaking. Everyone waited for someone else to act first, to declare either victory or regret. Neither came. Only the steady, clinical pulse of the next operational phase, reassessment of impact and readiness for secondary engagement. By midday, intelligence analysts confirmed what no one wanted to admit. Several of the targeted facilities were closer to civilian infrastructure than intended. Images began to leak. A school window shattered by shockwaves, a hospital in darkness, a child holding a fragment of an aircraft wing like an artifact from another reality. Yet the briefings remained unchanged. Collateral effects, they said, contained damage. The euphemisms spread faster than the fires. In private, however, one senior commander wrote in his log, "The precision is an illusion. Every strike hits more than its target. It hits something inside us." His words would never reach the official record, but they captured the sentiment rippling beneath the surface, that the cost of control was becoming indistinguishable from chaos. As night fell again, the world entered a strange silence. The airwaves cleared, the smoke began to settle, and yet the unease persisted. The retaliation had been executed flawlessly. The data confirmed success. But the atmosphere told another story. Cities dimmed their lights earlier that evening, as if trying to disappear from view. Streets emptied. Conversations shifted to whispers. The war, though not declared, had already learned how to speak in code. And in the deepest hours of that night, while the machines cooled and the headlines celebrated precision, the soldiers who carried out the orders stared into the dark, not at what they destroyed, but at what was now missing. Something had been removed from the world, something intangible, something human. It wasn't victory. It was the realization that even the cleanest war leaves no clean hands. The echo of retaliation still hung in the air, not as a sound, but as a presence, invisible and unending. It would follow every decision that came after, every speech, every silence. For those who commanded it, the operation was a success. For everyone else, it was a reminder that once vengeance is set in motion, it no longer belongs to those who ordered it. It belongs to history. They rarely show the moment after the strike, when the noise fades and only the emptiness remains. Stay with us, because the silence after the echo is often louder than the blast itself. The decision had been made hours before anyone spoke it aloud. It moved through encrypted lines like a current, invisible, impersonal, inevitable. By the time dawn began to creep across the horizon, the authorization codes had already been entered, the coordinates confirmed, the signatures given. There was no ceremony, no final word, no appeal to morality. Only a silence so deliberate it felt like a ritual. And then, the first signal went through. A sequence of numbers, meaningless to most, but enough to awaken the machines. At 4:23, the retaliation began. From the command room, the world appeared as a lattice of moving pixels. Blue for friendly, red for hostile, gray for unknown. The drones rose in perfect formation, their engines whispering through the cold air like mechanical prayers. Missiles launched from ships positioned far beyond any visible horizon, their trails vanishing into the atmosphere. Everything moved with the precision of a heartbeat, guided by satellites and human resolve. On the surface, it looked like order. In truth, it was the most organized form of chaos the modern age could produce. Each strike had a purpose: fuel reserves, radar arrays, military communication relays, the arteries of infrastructure that kept the opposing machine alive. To the commanders watching the feeds, it was not destruction, but arithmetic. Numbers erased, objectives achieved, systems neutralized. One by one, the lights on the digital map began to fade. Every vanishing signal meant success. Every success meant another line crossed. Inside the control centers, no one spoke above a whisper. The air was heavy with focus, but beneath it, something colder lingered. The awareness that every executed command carried a shadow. The analysts tracked the impact waves, the collateral spreads, the shifting weather currents that redirected debris. They spoke of blast radii and containment zones, as if naming the chaos could make it smaller. In the first hour, 6 sites were hit. In the second, 9 more. Then, the network went dark. The silence that followed was not relief. It was the silence of comprehension, the understanding that the strike, though successful in its design, had set something uncontrollable in motion. The machines obeyed perfectly. Humanity, less so. On the ground, witnesses described the sky as a wound opening above them. The horizon pulsed orange and violet, as if dawn itself had been set ablaze. From a distance, the explosions were beautiful. Clean arcs of light reflected in the black surface of nearby lakes. Up close, they were unbearable. The ground trembled, alarms screamed, and 1,000 disconnected voices filled the frequencies at once, each trying to describe what words could no longer contain. Official briefings came swiftly, as though prepared long before the attack itself. A limited and proportionate response, they called it, a necessary measure to preserve collective defense. The phrasing was identical across every capital, as if all governments now spoke the same script written by necessity. Yet even as they uttered the words, the footage contradicted them. Transmission towers collapsing into flame, supply convoys burning along highways, fragments of metal embedded in walls marked with civilian insignias. Somewhere, deep underground, a group of officers watched the live feed from thermal drones as plumes of heat rose from the ruins. One of them, a man who had fought in earlier wars, leaned closer to the screen and said quietly, "It's always colder after the fire." No one replied. They all knew what he meant. Retaliation had no warmth. It was precision without empathy, motion without meaning. The retaliation did not stop at the border. Within hours, neighboring territories went into lockdown. Airspace sealed, trade halted, communication disrupted. Fear moved faster than any aircraft. It spread through markets, through governments, through living rooms where people watched the news with faces pale in the glow of their televisions. The phrase counterstrike began to trend globally, accompanied by images too symmetrical to be coincidence. The world, it seemed, was now writing its own sequel to history's oldest story. Blow answered by blow, cause eclipsed by consequence. By midday, diplomats were already drafting the statements that would frame the event as defensive. In the same buildings, military analysts calculated how much time remained before a counter-response would begin. Their estimates varied. Some said 12 hours, others 6. A few said less. Each projection ended with the same word, escalation. In the corridors of intelligence agencies, people spoke in codes designed to conceal fear. Thermal fluctuations meant explosions. Communication loss meant casualties. Stabilization measures meant retaliation in waiting. The language of war had evolved into a dialect of denial, precise, detached, almost elegant in its cruelty. As night returned, the world's focus shifted from the targets to the aftermath. Satellite images of craters and firestorms filled every broadcast. Analysts debated legality, commentators debated morality, but the soldiers and pilots, the ones who had pressed the buttons and guided the machines, had already gone silent. They sat in dark rooms, staring at the faint glow of monitors showing the same landscapes they had erased hours earlier. There was nothing left to interpret, only the quiet hum of machinery cooling down after the act. And in that silence, something deeper emerged. Not victory, not relief, but an emptiness that seemed to echo through every corridor, every bunker, every office. The operation had succeeded perfectly. Yet perfection, it turned out, carried its own form of defeat. The more precise the strike, the more complete the void it left behind. Outside, the world continued to move. News anchors reciting numbers, markets recalibrating, politicians rehearsing their phrases. But beneath the surface, everyone felt it. The faint, resonant hum of something irreversible. The echo of retaliation. It was not the sound of power, nor even of vengeance. It was the sound of a system fulfilling its purpose, and realizing too late that purpose itself had become indistinguishable from ruin. They say vengeance restores balance. But when the sky itself becomes the weapon, balance is only another name for silence. The retaliation had ended, but the unity that delivered it did not survive the night. Behind the triumphant headlines and carefully worded communiques, the first fractures began to appear. Thin, almost invisible at first, like stress lines on glass under pressure. They ran through conference rooms, private chats, and closed diplomatic corridors, whispering of fatigue, disagreement, and the quiet recognition that the cost of solidarity was becoming unbearable. In Brussels, the mood shifted from discipline to doubt. The once unified rhetoric now carried undertones of resentment, even fear. Ministers spoke in public of unprecedented cohesion, yet behind closed doors, their voices dropped into cautious tones. One delegate described the atmosphere as a room full of allies who no longer trust the echoes of their own words. The tension wasn't loud. It was surgical, silent, precise. The kind that eats through the structure without leaving visible damage until it's too late. The problem wasn't the enemy. It was the mirror. Each member nation saw its reflection in the decisions made, and didn't like what it saw. For some, the strike had gone too far. For others, not far enough. The moral high ground, once easy to claim, now looked like a cliff edge. The internal reports circulating through the diplomatic network read less like analysis and more like confession. Phrases such as strategic exhaustion, communication fatigue, and loss of interpretive control appeared again and again, as if describing not a military coalition, but a human organism on the verge of collapse. In capitals across Europe, intelligence briefings turned defensive. Governments demanded proof, not of who attacked, but of whether their allies had told them the whole truth. Questions emerged in the margins of classified reports. When was the decision made? Who gave the final approval? Why were some informed later than others? The answers, when they came, were wrapped in bureaucratic courtesy, but carried the weight of accusation. The media, once aligned with the official line, began to shift tone. Journalists started speaking of dissonance within command structures and divergent threat assessments. Words that had been taboo only days earlier, miscommunication, internal pressure, policy drift, now slipped into televised debates. Viewers sensed it too. The confidence that had once defined the alliance's voice was gone. What remained was something rawer, more human, the tremor that follows conviction. Inside the alliance's headquarters, strategy meetings began to resemble therapy sessions. Advisors spoke less of operations and more of optics, less of tactics and more of emotional management. One participant described the mood as a collective hangover after moral adrenaline. The sense of purpose that had driven the initial unity was dissolving into procedural numbness. Everyone continued to play their part, but the performance had lost its conviction. In the private notes of one senior diplomat, later leaked and widely circulated, a single line stood out. "We no longer fear the enemy. We fear each other's hesitation." That sentence became the unspoken truth of the alliance. The fear wasn't about betrayal, but paralysis. That moment when every actor realizes they're following a script that no longer makes sense, but no one dares to stop the play. Between Washington and Berlin, tensions rose quietly. The timing of announcements, the framing of briefings, the tone of speeches, each became a battlefield of interpretation. Statements meant to reassure were dissected as veiled rebukes. Even the smiles during joint press conferences began to look strained, practiced. Observers noticed it first in the body language. The crossed arms, the downward glances, the seconds of delay before applause. Meanwhile, intelligence reports warned that the adversary was exploiting the visible cracks, testing air defenses, launching cyber intrusions, spreading targeted misinformation. But even that no longer united the allies. Some saw it as proof that their deterrence was working. Others, that their cohesion was breaking. The very foundation of mutual defense, trust, had turned fragile. And in the corridors of power, people began to whisper that the greatest threat to the alliance might no longer come from outside. As days passed, exhaustion became palpable. The endless meetings, the rehearsed reassurances, the moral balancing acts, all of it began to weigh down the participants. Leaders aged overnight, their eyes dull from constant vigilance. They no longer spoke of victory, only of stability, a word that had begun to sound like a euphemism for survival. Even the language of diplomacy seemed to fray, its vocabulary shrinking to a handful of phrases: dialogue, unity, resolve. Words repeated until they lost their meaning. One by one, nations began to look inward. Domestic unrest grew as citizens questioned the cost of confrontation. Protests flickered across cities, at first small, then impossible to ignore. They weren't protests against the enemy. They were protests against uncertainty, against fatigue, against the slow realization that even the strongest alliances cannot wage war forever without turning the war inward. Inside one late-night strategy session, an aide reportedly whispered, "We are not allies anymore. We are witnesses." The phrase circulated quietly among staff, unacknowledged but understood. The war had stopped being external. It had become psychological, a test of how long belief could survive reality. And yet, despite the cracks, the machinery of cooperation still moved, driven by inertia. Press releases continued, troops remained deployed, sanctions expanded. The alliance, like a great ship struck below the waterline, still floated, but no one knew for how long. The question was no longer whether they could win, it was whether they could endure their own reflection long enough to remember why they fought together in the first place. In the end, it wasn't the bombs, the sanctions, or the speeches that defined this phase. It was the silence that followed every meeting, the look in their eyes when the cameras turned off, the heavy pause before the word unity was spoken again. Beneath that pause lay the truth everyone felt but refused to name. The alliance had begun to fracture not from pressure, but from within, and no one yet knew how to stop the quiet collapse of conviction. The war, for most people, still existed as light, flickering across screens, transmitted through headlines, filtered through the trembling voices of commentators. But as the days passed, that light began to burn. It no longer illuminated. It blinded. The narrative fractured just as the alliance had, 1,000 versions of the same event, each claiming to be truth, each sounding like an echo of someone else's fear. In the streets, the silence broke first. Crowds formed, hesitant, shapeless at the start, then growing into something that felt less like protest and more like collective disorientation. People carried signs not of ideology, but of confusion. Who started this? What are we fighting for? The slogans changed daily, the tone shifting from outrage to exhaustion. It was no longer a movement against anyone. It was a movement against the fog that had settled over everything. News anchors spoke in calm, deliberate tones, yet their eyes betrayed panic. Each network had its own version of the truth. Some showed footage of heroism, others, devastation. The same explosion, filmed from two angles, became both justification and tragedy, depending on who edited it. Commentators began to speak not about facts, but about belief, as though reality itself had turned subjective, negotiable. Social media drowned in its own reflection. Every clip, every statement, every trembling video from a street corner became evidence for one side and manipulation for another. Accounts multiplied like shadows, each claiming to expose lies, each feeding a deeper hunger for certainty that no longer existed. The algorithms learned faster than humans did. They amplified outrage, rewarded despair, punished silence. Within days, the public discourse had turned into a hall of mirrors, each reflection sharper, crueler, more distorted than the last. In cafes and offices, the conversations grew quieter. Friends avoided subjects that once defined them. Families split not by ideology, but by interpretation. The question wasn't who is right, but who can still be believed. Those who tried to stay neutral found themselves accused by both sides. Neutrality itself became a form of defiance. Governments, sensing the shift, doubled down on message discipline. New regulations on digital responsibility appeared overnight. Laws written in the language of protection but enforced through silence. Official spokespeople began to appear daily, repeating phrases designed to calm, but instead amplifying unease. "The situation is under control," they said, even as sirens echoed in distant cities and markets convulsed like nervous systems under stress. The media sphere, once a mirror of the world, now resembled a battlefield of perception. Journalists clung to words like verified, independent, confirmed, but those words had lost gravity. Viewers scrolled past them like ghosts drifting through smoke. Information no longer anchored reality, it replaced it. And in that substitution, people found both comfort and terror. It was easier to believe something, anything, than to accept the emptiness of not knowing. Small groups formed in basements, on encrypted channels, in private forums, fragments of society searching for coherence. They shared leaks, theories, whispered testimonies. Some were genuine, many were not. It didn't matter anymore. Truth had become less valuable than belonging. In a fractured world, belief was the new currency. Across cities, protests returned, not massive, but persistent, like a fever that refused to break. Some marched against the war, others marched against silence. Most marched because they no longer knew what else to do. The slogans grew contradictory: freedom through strength, peace through truth through noise. The words collided, tangled, lost meaning. But the movement itself, the act of standing, of walking, became its own kind of language. Artists began to fill the void left by politics. Murals appeared overnight on scorched walls, faces of unknown victims, symbols of unity, words scratched into brick. Remember what it felt like before the noise. But by morning, many were painted over. In their place came new posters, state-approved messages of resilience and resolve. The dialogue between the two became a rhythm that pulsed through the cities, a call and response between power and people. Psychologists called it collective derealization, the slow erosion of shared perception. For many, the war no longer felt external. It had become internal. Anxiety replaced ideology. People didn't argue over who was right. They argued over what was real. The battlefield had moved from territories to timelines, from cities to minds. In one viral video, a woman stood in front of a burning building holding her phone toward the flames. "They say this didn't happen," she whispered, "but I'm watching it burn." The clip spread faster than any official statement. For days, it became the symbol of the era, one person's attempt to anchor herself in a world where even fire could be called fake. Meanwhile, think tanks and analysts published reports on information stability. Governments promised truth initiatives, but truth had already become a marketplace. Every side sold its version wholesale, polished and framed. The consumer was the citizen, the product, their conviction. As the days turned into weeks, the fatigue became universal. No one trusted the silence anymore. When the broadcasts paused, people assumed censorship. When they resumed, people assumed manipulation. Even calmness felt suspicious. The war had become omnipresent, not through its violence, but through its persistence. It was there in the tone of morning news, in the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen, in the awkward pauses between co-workers who no longer dared to speak freely. And somewhere between propaganda and panic, a strange awareness began to take root, that perhaps no one was lying completely, and no one was telling the full truth, that the war had stopped being a conflict between sides and become a conflict between realities. Each person carried their own front line now, invisible and internal. In this new world, fear was not a reaction, it was the atmosphere itself. It seeped into gestures, conversations, dreams. People didn't talk about victory anymore. They talked about surviving the noise, about remembering something true enough to hold on to. Yet even that, in the endless mirror of narratives, felt fragile. And so, the war continued. Not just in skies and borders, but in the reflection staring back from every screen, every mind, every sleepless window lit by the glow of a truth no one could prove. Atmosphere, the foretaste of escalation, fear of the unknown, the circle of history closing upon itself, irreversibility, the realization that the war is now inside everyone, the world after the point of no return. Format: the epilogue before a new phase of conflict and the philosophical finale, where reflection replaces certainty. The world had grown too quiet. Not the peace of recovery, but the silence that comes when every sound has already been spent. Cities functioned as if nothing had changed. Trains ran, lights flickered, news anchors smiled. But beneath the surface, something coiled, invisible and dense, like static before a storm. It was the kind of calm that humanity always mistakes for safety, the breath drawn before history exhales again. In diplomatic halls, the meetings continued, gestures of normality, languages of procedure, but the voices had changed. Every sentence was weighed, every silence translated. The documents spoke of containment, but the eyes of those signing them spoke of inevitability. Too many lines had been crossed, too many phrases spoken that could not be unsaid. Retaliation had become ritual, justification had become reflex. The world no longer sought to understand who began this cycle, only who would survive its continuation. Satellite images still tracked the smoldering scars of previous nights. Reconstruction teams worked under the hum of drones that no longer distinguished between protection and surveillance. People looked up at the sky with the same reflex they once reserved for prayer. The weather had become political, each thundercloud a metaphor, each flash of lightning a memory of fire. And through that uneasy stillness, the machinery of power turned silently. New coalitions formed behind closed doors. Old treaties reinterpreted themselves to fit the present tense. Nations rearmed not out of aggression, but out of ritual habit. The same way frightened people lock the door of a burning house. The analysts spoke of deterrence, of controlled escalation, of equilibrium maintained by mutual dread. But the deeper truth was simpler. The fear itself had become the system. Entire economies thrived on anticipation, on the illusion that preparation was protection. The more the world prepared for catastrophe, the more it guaranteed its arrival. In the cities, people pretended not to listen to the hum of engines in the night sky. But everyone heard it. Children learned the vocabulary of alerts before that of lullabies. Street artists painted murals of doves dissolving into ash. Psychologists described a new phenomenon: anticipatory trauma. The collective condition of fearing events that haven't yet occurred because everyone knows they will. It was in this waiting, in this suspended breath, that the next phase began. Not with an explosion, but with the quiet realization that no one could tell where the last phase had ended. The line between aftermath and prelude had blurred. The world had become a circle, endlessly revolving through shock, reaction, reflection, and return. For those who still sought meaning, it could be found only in fragments: the small defiance of a mother planting flowers beside a crater, the laughter of strangers sharing power outages, the flicker of light in a city that refused to go dark. Humanity, stripped of illusions, still found ways to imitate hope. But even that hope had changed. It no longer promised peace, only endurance. As the wind shifted, the silence deepened, and with it came the understanding that the storm was not coming from outside anymore. It was within, in the fatigue, in the mistrust, in the quiet normalization of the unthinkable. The war had escaped geography. It had entered language, memory, instinct. Nations were only its vessels now. The true battlefield was the collective mind, and somewhere, beyond all strategies and speeches, the human heart still asked its forbidden question: when will this end? But history, patient and unhurried, offered no answer. It had learned to repeat itself too well. By the time the next broadcast began, the script was ready. The same solemn words, the same promises of restraint, the same insistence that control was still possible. And yet, behind the cameras, the officials stared into the glass panels of teleprompters and saw their own reflections, tired, uncertain, aware that they were speaking not to prevent the storm, but to delay the realization that it had already arrived. Outside, the horizon flickered again, distant, muted, almost beautiful. People didn't flinch anymore. They watched it the way one watches the sea, knowing the tide will always return. The war had ceased to be a sequence of events. It had become a state of existence, a rhythm embedded in the modern heartbeat. And then came the final silence, not the absence of sound, but of denial. The moment when every citizen, every soldier, every leader understood that there would be no final act, no definitive peace. The storm had no direction because it lived within the world itself. In that silence, truth revealed its last shape, not as revelation, but as fatigue. The realization that after so many cycles of fear and defiance, the only frontier left to defend was the human capacity to feel at all. For some, that was enough to keep going. For others, it was the end. The last message of the night played on every screen: stay informed, stay safe, stay calm. But no one really listened. People stared into their reflections, the glow of the news washing over their faces, and understood that the mirror had finally fused with the window. There was no longer a world outside the broadcast, only its echo. And still, somewhere beyond the static, a quiet voice seemed to whisper, not from the news, not from the governments, but from within the collective silence itself. They will call it peace, but it will only be the pause between storms. Stay with us, for this story is not ending. It is beginning again. Subscribe not to the channel, but to the truth that refuses to disappear. The one that still flickers, fragile but alive, beneath the noise.